my
Well, Gus,
apologize.
that's okay. And I would very much like to say hello to everyone and welcome. I'm Connie Nestor Anderson, and I want to wish you all a hearty welcome to the Scottish American History Forum. And yes, you heard correctly. I wed Mr. Hopier Anderson in early May, and so I'm an old married lady now. So that's why you see the name change. Today, we have a huge group here. I'm going to admit a couple of people while I'm talking. A very interesting topic and an interesting speaker. We have lost a few of our folks from North Carolina because the Grandfather Mountain Games are underway this weekend, and so we'll miss them. But I'd like to tell you, I think most of you know, that the Scottish American History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots. It was formerly the Illinois St. Andrews Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois way back in 1845. It was later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. It's located in North Riverside, Illinois, and offices the full array of services. We have a brand new memory care building, assisted living, skilled nursing, independent living, shelter care, and on and on. So it's really a charity and a Scottish cause that all Scots can be proud of. Chicago Scots, by the way, is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to support of Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. Now, for additional information, you need only to go to www.chicagoscots.org, and we urge you all please to give generously to our senior care charity. Before we begin today, we do have Gus Noble with us, who is having some technical difficulties. But Gus Noble, OBE, by the way, is president of Caledonia and Chicago Scots. And Gus is going to greet everyone and bring us up to date, Gus, on what's going on.
Thank you, Connie, and apologies for the technical difficulties. My fault entirely. I didn't charge my headphones, so I was trying to listen and couldn't hear anything, so I apologize. First, I want to thank you, Connie, on your recent wedding. We're all so happy for you, and on behalf of all the Chicago Scots, and I'm sure I speak for everyone on the call today, we offer you our congratulations and best wishes for future health and happiness as you begin your life together.
Thank you.
We've recently had our Highland Games here in Chicago, and I have to say, I think it was, from a content perspective, a terrific event. I saw lots of smiling faces and people telling me how warm their hearts were, that they were all together celebrating Scotland and giving back to a wonderful cause that you articulated so well, Connie, at Caledonia Senior Living. Caledonia Senior Living, I think everybody knows we were the recipient of a huge philanthropic gift that gave us a foundational, the ability to kind of build on a strong foundation, some dreams that we've been working on, refining, and we have a little more work to do, but I think we're beginning to see something take shape that's both consistent with our past and modelled on a distinct and profound need we see in the future for more memory care. I think a centre of excellence for memory care tucked away in the woods in Chicago would be a wonderful place to spend your final years. So we're going to be working on that, and watch this space for more announcements. And Connie, as a member of our board, I really appreciate your insight and the world, the view of the world through your eyes. I bring you the greetings of everyone from Caledonia. We've recently been working with a gymnasium in Glasgow, believe it or not, who were founded in March 2020, probably the wrong time, the worst time you could open a gymnasium, given that was right at the start of the COVID pandemic. these two young lads, the Burns brothers, no relation to the man in the painting behind you, Connie, but these two young Burns brothers uh, decided what they would do in a really ingenious way is create a program for seniors in care homes, including their own family, in Glasgow. And they created this workout for seniors based on a seated position for people who are in wheelchairs or indeed in seats. And it's really quite thorough. It works out the whole body. These two young guys are not only very good-looking young Scotsmen, as all of us are, of course, but they're great fun. And these workouts, believe it or not, they do in their kilts. So with this great music playing, the residents of Caledonia Senior Living over a Zoom link work out with these guys in Glasgow. Now, they started off small in 2020 with 3 care homes in Glasgow. Fast forward 5 years, they now work 350 care homes across the UK, and we are now the first in the United States to work with them. When you come in on a Tuesday morning and see this activity taking place in the living room, it really lifts your spirits, as all things at Caledonia do. And I'll tell you, just before I stop and hand up back to you, Connie, I'll tell you what I saw as I left Caledonia last night. On Friday night, the residents were having cocktails, and they had a temporary tattoo session. So they were all tattooing themselves with these wonderful designs and patriotic symbols and kind of eagles and dragons, and the laughter coming out of staff and residents together just warmed my heart and sent me off into the weekend with a spring in my step. That's what Caledonia does. That's what we as a community do, and I'm so proud to be part of this community along with all of you. So with that, Connie, thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to our speaker today, Dr. Dunlop. I was speaking with someone in Detroit, perhaps a distant cousin, perhaps not too distant, Peg Dunlop, who is a very, very good friend of mine. And she sends her best regards.
Oh, very nice. Back to her, likewise.
Well, and Gus, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we should give you a round of applause. Bravo. What you're doing at Caledonia is out of this world, really, and
Thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you. We're going to move ahead pretty quickly. I do want to make just a couple of announcements. I just saw my buddy Maggie McEwen on the Zoom, and Maggie is the head, I'm going to forget your real title, but she's the commissioner for McEwen Clan in Canada. And I don't know how many of you plan to go up to Fergus, but I'm going this year. And Maggie, we're so looking forward to seeing you up there. Hope's going to host the Anderson Clan tent this time, so we won't be close to you in the lineup, but I'll find you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so I just have one more tiny announcement before we begin. Our speaker for August is quite ill and has withdrawn. He would like to speak later in 2026. However, I've reached out to Giles Ingram, who was committed to speak in April 2026, and he's pretty sure he can do it on August 9th. He is the chief executive for Abbotsford, which is the home of Sir Walter Scott. And he's going to speak on Sir Walter and the world of Sir Walter at Abbotsford. So that should be very interesting. I'm sure you won't want to miss it. And if something happens that Giles cannot, I have another person in the queue from the University of Aberdeen. So we'll be with you next month. It'll be grand as always. And so now it is time to move forward with our presentation today. And we are so very pleased to have with us, live from the state of Maine, in the forest, in her wonderful home, Dr. Julie Dunlop. And she is the Vice President and Secretary for the Maine Ulster-Scots project, which is terribly important. And she's going to talk to us about the Scots-Irish Self-Reliance on the Eastern Frontier, living and dying on the Dummer claim. Julie, we're absolutely delighted to have you. I'm going to ask everybody to dim your cameras and your microphones. And Julie, if you'll get your presentation up, we'll get started.
All right, I'm sending a request to share. And while that's loading up, thank you, Connie, for your kind introduction. Appreciate that. I'm so looking forward to this time with you folks. Wait. Can you see my presentation?
I can see the view where the other slides are on the left-hand side. You just need to enlarge it to the...
Right from the beginning here to cue that. There we go. Can you see that?
Perfect. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So we'll go ahead here. Oops. The Maine Ulster-Scots Project is a 501c3 organization, and we've been operating in various capacities for about 14 years now. The Ulster-Scots Agency, or Story, in Maine, and their influence on New England has been greatly overlooked by the traditional historical narrative. Confirmed in the 2020 U.S. Census is that per capita, Maine has the highest percentage of self-identified Scottish and Scots-Irish descendants in the entire United States. Our mission is to promote awareness of Maine's Scots-Irish heritage and to gather, save, and share the stories of Maine's Scots-Irish families. I'm not going to get into the details of why the Ulster plantation was settled in the beginning or the background history of Scotland, but we'll focus on the arrival of these Scots-Irish immigrants to the Casco Bay area and how they managed to pull themselves together into a viable community, and much through their own efforts. And for the purpose of this presentation, the first settlers are referred to as immigrants, EM, because at the time of the migration in 1718, they were British subjects. Hence, they emigrated within their home country. You can see by this diagram here on the right, a mass population of lowland Scots and border English relocated to the north of Ireland, to the Ulster province here, starting in the early 1600s, and thanks to King James I for developing that plantation scheme. And then the Ulster immigrants, the Scots-Irish, made their way to coastal Maine and New England. A significant migration of Ulster-Scots to Maine starting in 1718 and continued through 1764. Now, to be clear, the Scots-Irish, by their identity, are from Scotland, and they see themselves out of Scotland and not Ireland. They emigrated from the island of Ireland, but by identity, they are Scottish. This talk is divided into two halves. So in the first half, I'll be talking about the land possession, family, forming a Clachan community, creating commerce, and exercising self-governance. This background history will segue into discussing the beginnings of the American Revolutionary War, which I'll cover in the second half. So at the time of 1718, in the beginning of the arrival of the Scots-Irish from the north of Ireland to what is now the state of Maine, the district was divided up between French interests to the east. You can see it on the map here, the map for 1603 to 1763. The English interests to the west, and the Native American interests to the center and north. And this is the District of Maine here. So the District of Maine was border country, as you can see. It's considered border country, and border country was nothing new for the Scots-Irish. Borderlands had been their home for centuries. And what may come as a surprise to some of you who have delved into this history is the amount of vessel traffic that took place between the north of Ireland and New England. Two of the longtime volunteers with MUSP continued to conduct exhaustive research on that ship traffic. One of them is here with us today, Dave McCausland. He's our organization's treasurer and resident printmaster. And I'll share a few details from that research. So there's a lot of talk about the 5 ships that arrived at coastal Maine in 1718, but there were actually 19 ships that docked at ports in the New England area in 1718. 11 more ships followed in 1719 and 13 in 1720, ostensibly of some major immigration over that 3-year period. And the immigrants' arrival put them smack dab in the center of the frontier between the European and the Native American settlement. Here on this slide that at the time of the American Revolution, there were 31 communities of Scots and Scots-Irish in the area that is now the state of Maine, so the District of Maine, when they were populated by Scots-Irish. It's important to note that the District of Maine was a region embedded in the Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1628 to 1691, and then of the province of Massachusetts until 1820 when Maine gained statehood. So the District of Maine was a region in New England that has always been separate from the Commonwealth, if you will. At the time of the Ulster-Scots immigrants' arrival, New England had been through a series of Indian wars, which had left the District of Maine vulnerable and reeked by devastation. Basically, all of the European settlements east of York, Maine, had been wiped out. The Candlemas Massacre of 1692, in what was known then as New Scotland, now York, involved several hundred people being attacked by French and Indian forces. In short order, Cotton Mather came on the scene with his notion of how to respond to these raids and to garner the safety of the Puritans, merchants, and their livelihoods. So reading in this paragraph here, on the 20th of September 1706, Mather records, quote, "I write letters unto divers persons of honor, both in Scotland and in England, to procure settlements of good Scotch-Irish colonies to the northward of us. This may be a thing of great consequence." So it was Mather's plan to settle hardy families on the frontiers in Maine and New Hampshire to protect the towns and churches of Massachusetts from the French and Indians. Hence, the early 1700s witnessed a significant outflow of Scots-Irish from the Ulster province caused by economic pressure, particularly rack renting and tariffs imposed by the linen industry, and agricultural challenges due to poor harvests and droughts that led to periodic famines. A catalyst was the Test Act of 1704. And that meant that Presbyterian ministers could not conduct meetings or marriages, baptisms, nor hold public office. So essentially, marriages were nullified, baptisms were nullified, so couples were not legally married, and children were bastards. One of the families that took the hottest hit in the Candlemas Day complication was the Dummer family. The Reverend Shubael Dummer and his wife were killed and their children abducted. The Dummer family themselves were a political family out of Massachusetts with many commerce strings. And the Dummer family is the source of the land title I'm going to discuss with today. Specifically, I'll touch on land speculation and a section of 900 acres they had acquired known as the Dummer Claim. If you take a look at this map from the 1750s, circled in red is the Dummer Claim land plotting, which is now situated in the eastern part of Freeport, formerly ancient North Yarmouth, and tucked up against Brunswick. The claim itself was included in the infrastructure for the village of ancient North Yarmouth, but was situated 10 miles away by water The infrastructure for the Brunswick community at the falls was 8 to 10 miles away from the claim. So that left the Dummer claim settlement perched off by themselves, out of the benefit of any infrastructure having been created. And settlers were virtually on their own, which gives them a special quality for us to study a nascent society of Scots-Irish, making it day by day, even though they had contacts with the larger world, but day by day in their own situation as a microcosm. Here's a map that shows the Dummer claim, Dummer's claim here, which was acquired by the Dummer family prior to King William's War and then abandoned during the time period. It's described as being some 900 to 1,000 acres, and it probably was all of that. Behind you, you'll see the lotting square and rectangular square rough lotting patterns, which were part of the North Yarmouth settlement at the time. The North Yarmouth settlement, of course, was basically a Puritan congregational church homestead settlement, whereas the Dummer claim was separate from that in its land title and did not operate on a homestead system. Joining in on the surrounding lots were uncommitted lands, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the uncommitted lands were for the interest rather than by homesteading. So you have the Scots-Irish community here, and the Dummer claim surrounded by congregational Puritan-based Massachusetts pioneers as a little fitted background on the Dummer family. In 1722, John Powell, a descendant of the original owner of the Dummer claim, Richard Dummer, inherited the interest of the Dummer family in Freeport and the Dummer claim. Powell was Richard Dummer's great-grandson, and he was a member of the Committee for Resettlement during the Indian War's previous land titles. The property had been abandoned, and when the property owners and others decided to resettle the area, somebody had to sort out whose claims were valid and whose weren't. A committee was formed to do that, and John Powell was on that committee. Powell ended up owning the Dummer claim itself, and he had an interest in the surrounding uncommitted lands that I showed you on the earlier map. Highlighted in green here at the bottom is the Dummer claim.
Really have a good time.
I remember how old Ryan.
Oh, I'm sure you will. I'm listening to a Scots-Irish settlement of Maine.
Yes, thank you. Highlighted in green, seen here at the bottom are the lots that were created and different families who are involved. They're all Scots-Irish. And the land highlighted in yellow immediately adjacent, right here, the uncommitted lands, which were also divided up and sold to Scots-Irish. To the east was the Brunswick settlement under Reverend Woodside. Woodside led the Presbyterian parish of Dunbow near Coleraine, Ireland, to coastal Maine on the ship McCallum in 1718. And in the west was the land managed by the North Yarmouth proprietors from Massachusetts. This is a land deed for Gideon Mann, one of my sixth-generation paternal great-grandfathers, who had emigrated in 1718, and he purchased his land, his 100 acres on the Dummer clan for 93 pounds, 6 shillings, and 8 pence. That, my friends, was a lot of money in pounds sterling. When all the people surrounding them on the North Yarmouth settlement were acquiring the land by homesteading through clearing so many acres of land, building a structure and homesteading, or a structure and fencing on so many acres of land in a given time period in order to acquire title to their property, the Scots-Irish on the Dummer's claim were paying pounds sterling in cash for their property. And this is of keen interest to MUSP, and it runs counterintuitive to a lot of the talk that you hear about Scots-Irish and the impoverishment they brought with them from the north of Ireland, for which they were warned out of Port Boston when they arrived. And these are the people who settled on the Dummer claim. Now, this practice was very different from latter descriptions of Scots-Irish who flooded into Pennsylvania in the 1740s and 50s, being desperately poor. The Ulster-Scot immigrants had apparently taken advantage of the early sale of their leaseholds in the north of Ireland, while the market was still available to give them some return on leasehold value. Later, as people left the north of Ireland, real estate prices collapsed due to economic conditions which deteriorated due to droughts and famines, and were victim to government and export regulations. If you'd like to learn more about contributing factors that led to mass immigration, I'm happy to share the list that we've compiled with you. So many of these people were much better off than the Scots-Irish immigrants who arrived in the 1740s. And I think that's something that's been overlooked to a large degree. Here's a close-up of the map, and it shows you who these families were. The Andersons out here on the Flying Point Peninsula, all the way up through here. And with the McFadden family, who was at another claim, and the other members of the 1718 group. So when the Ulster-Scot immigrants arrived at Flying Point on what was known as the Dummer claim, we're not exactly sure of exactly when, but it was quite early, we think around the 1730s. No settler down there got a deed to their property until the 1750s. But we're pretty sure that most of these families were on the ground and starting out prior to that. They didn't get a deed because the Dummer family hadn't gotten around to getting their claim settled and deciding what they wanted to do with their property. And that didn't get resolved for many years within the family. Originally, though, the area had been acquired in hopes that the Dummers could establish a northern source for farm animals or stock to sell in Boston town. The Massachusetts market was becoming more and more slim given the immigrants who had come from Europe, and there was a high demand for livestock. The area around Boston was getting used up for farmland, so colonists had moved east and north, making a foothold in the District of Maine, but they lost that foothold during the French and Indian War. So the land became available, and the Scots-Irish bought it, and those first settlers, but those first settlers were isolated. Under the leadership and supervision of colonial history archaeologist Pamela Crane, with the help and cooperation of the McFadden family, Musp researchers investigated and documented this first footprint homestead of a 1718 Ulster-Scots family at the former Somerset colony on the westerly shore of Merrymeeting Bay in Maine. Andrew McFadden, with his wife Jane Lindsay, and family carved their home from the forest and established themselves in a wood frame home dug into earthen walls upon their arrival in September 1718. So they had to dig in literally before winter hit, and only to be burned out during the summer raids of Lovewell's War in 1722. Discovering and studying this unique site presented a rare opportunity for us to examine the transition from an Ulster environment and culture to life in America's eastern frontier. And many of the dedicated volunteers are descendants of those first 1718 Ulster pioneers to the coast of Maine and New England. For example, Judy Lindsay here. Now, years later, Jane McFadden, Andrew McFadden's wife, was deposed regarding litigation brought against the McFaddens by the great proprietors disputing land boundaries of the Somerset colony. And one of our descendants is here. Deborah Moore is here. Raise your hand, Deborah. She is a direct descendant of the McFaddens. Now, in that litigation, Esquire John Adams, the John Adams, rode up to Maine by horseback in 1768 to adjudicate that case at the Pulnaborough Courthouse in Maine. So the McFaddens won the case. But interestingly, following that settlement, Adams was immediately retained by a law firm in Boston that represented land speculators and proprietors who were bringing lawsuits against other settlers. So it begs the question, how did the newcomers manage to organize and be successful in that austere environment in what we call the wild lands? Well, there's a couple of petitions that we find early on in the record that'll give some indication. By 1763, The settlers were petitioning the government in North Yarmouth to help them build the road through Bunganock on the town line with Brunswick, so they could go to the mill, the meeting house, and other conveniences. To go to a meeting in North Yarmouth, they were to travel by boat and then sail the Royal River to attend the church services over there, which was a congregational system, not a Presbyterian system. Whereas if they could get the Bunganock way cleared, they could participate in Presbyterian services and deal with other conveniences, as they put it here. There was a mill at Bunganock that was established by Reverend Woodside's grandson. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But you see, you have the same families here. You see the same families here, yeah, as on the Dummer claim. Some families here didn't own property. Their names don't show up on the land deeds. But if you're descended from this group, you may not even be aware that there are some people here you might not have run into in your research, such as Thomas Campbell and Silas Wentworth, yeah, John Ray, and others. Later, Dummer claim settlers became embroiled in a dispute with North Yarmouth when the town of Freeport petitioned to be set off as a separate town from North Yarmouth. The residents wrote a petition back to, these are our Ulster-Scots, they wrote a petition back to the selectmen of North Yarmouth, plainly saying, quote, "We are fine as we are, in that we have our own minister. The pay for that minister is being provided out of our taxes and is being paid to North Yarmouth in the form of a rebate of 28 pounds sterling a year." So somewhere along the way, North Yarmouth said, yes, you people are a part of our organization, our township, but you are so far away that we understand you need to be able to take care of yourselves. And here's some kickback money, because you're obviously not using up our infrastructure over here, you know, depending on our schools, you're not using our roads, you're not using our minister. So they had a little world for themselves, these settlers. And we've got George Rogers, the Chases, Campbells, Pickmans, Googans, Andersons, Cobbs, more Andersons, and a gentleman by the name of Crewer. You can see here, Daniel Crewer, right there, who later changed his name to Brewer. I'm not sure what the heck his origin was, but he was amongst the Scots-Irish on the Dummer claim, as was Anna van Dyck of the Netherlands, who was married to an Anderson. Now, the people of the Dummer claim naturally had to help each other out a good deal. And one of the things they would have had to help with was harvesting timber, as well as building structures and roadways. It took a clan. The greatest source of income at that point in time was to sell timber for the King's Mess, for the Royal Navy. But if you cut down a pine tree that was over 100 feet long and 4 feet on the butt, you weren't going to haul it out of the woods with a pair of steers. You're going to need a lot of steers. And everybody in the neighborhood would have had to chip in to do that. The Mass Landing was acquiring the mast wood to ship to England and was 3 to 4 miles west of today's Mass Landing landmark in Freeport. And the Manns, the Andersons, and others would have had to bring in all their animals and work together to get that accomplished. But they would have acquired a pretty darn decent income from that, because the King's masts at that time were going for a very high price. Another thing they had to do was care for their own dead. And this became a community effort, as we've discovered in our researching, because the cemetery that's there in the center of the Dummer claim on the old John Mann property contains the remains of multiple families. And there's at least 170 dead buried in there. And we have cairns too, and ancient indigenous people burial grounds. Each of these blue flags that you see represents a burial site that we've been able to uncover with the help of colonial history archaeologist Pam Crane. It's a fascinating spot, and it's interesting because at the time of these burials, there would have been a town cemetery established in Freeport where the town hall was. And there was a church cemetery established as a congregational church in Freeport, but neither of those places was used. They stayed here on their own property and were buried among their neighbors in a large Scots-Irish community cemetery or graveyard. The Scots-Irish in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s were burying their dead mostly with markers. These markers were made from local field stones. And today we find piles of schist from the shoreline along the waterfront next to the cemetery where the markers were fashioned. In fact, if you get out over the bank a little bit, you can see the tailings from where they were chiseled out, these headstones, and to make them into various shapes. This one has the pointed shape at the top. Others are rectangular and flat across the top, and all of them have been shaped by hand and chisel. Some of them have broken off in later years, but many of them have been there for so long in the ground that you won't find them unless you break the turf back. Now, in this photograph, you can see this 250-year-old or older oak tree. And we are wondering in our organization if the Ulster-Scot immigrants didn't happen to bring a seedling with them. It's planted directly in the center of a person's grave, and all of the younger 100-year-old oaks surrounding it are from the mother or father tree. There's another Ulster-Scots graveyard just down the road that has a central large red oak to it, which makes us wonder if they didn't plant that on purpose and maybe use it as a landmark. For instance, if you want to find Captain James Dunning, he's down there buried by the old oak. Yeah. Another practice that we're researching is discovering a semicircle of medium-sized field stones in front of several of the headstones in this cemetery here, and wondering if that doesn't have more of a pagan flair to it, but it's something to think about. Another thing they did amongst themselves to establish community was to start school systems. Of course, there were schools in the North Yarmouth system, but the Scots-Irish were creating their own school systems. And there was a schoolhouse built on Gideon Man's property at the corner of Burnett and Flying Point Roads, which eventually rotted down and was replaced in the early 1800s with the new schoolhouse. But the townsmen raised the money for the schoolhouse amongst themselves, anywhere from 20 cents to $3.60, contributed by the people in the settlement. And that schoolhouse is still standing. It's now called the Thomas Means Club. And the photograph here is of descendants of Thomas Means, who had a family reunion down there a few years ago. And I'll talk more about Means in a little bit. It's also interesting to me not only to be talking about the difference in money that was to these settlers and those later Scots-Irish settlers, but the idea that many of the Scots-Irish who came here were not very literate. And that assumption is hogwash. These Scots-Irish who were studying here in Maine in the early 1718 group were obviously literate. You saw from the petition there, they had signed their own names to the petition and their land deeds, and they didn't sign with X marks the spot. The handwriting is very good, and ostensibly education was of value as they established school systems very early on. And I think it's good to remember that the ideas of our immigrant forefathers being desperately poor and ignorant of education was not always so, especially among the first settlers. And this segues into the Mainer psyche. They had a need to have education to establish the bottom-up philosophy of religion and self-governance. It was not a top-down system that they were working in. It was a bottom-up system. It fit in neatly with a New England town living a system of governance from the bottom up. And I'll lean more into the cultural aspects here in the second half. Now, another way to establish commerce and community was to build ships. It was impossibly expensive for one family typically to be able to build a ship, so they would have had shares amongst themselves, and they'd ship in what materials were needed and labored among themselves to outfit homemade ships in the area. This ship was built by one of the Anderson families. It was called the Brig Belfast, interestingly. And this drawing comes from a notebook that has been handed down to a great-grand cousin of mine from his Anderson ancestors of Flying Point. The Pattons, that might be a familiar name, Actor Patton, Hector Patton, Matthew Patton, they lived next door to the Meanses And the Patton family also became a very substantial shipbuilding family, and this is one of their ships. Now, wood products were obviously one of the prime commercially outsourced goods. People were demanding lumber in New England for the growth of the New England market. People were demanding timber for ships, and the Reverend Woodside's family had established a sawmill at Bunganock. The sawmill was originally hydro-powered, of course, but this was in the same location where at a later date they installed a steam engine to run the operation. So this would have been a house that was built by the Woodside descendants at a location where a sawmill could be set up and accessed by local residents. Interestingly enough, this enterprise is going to lead into, in a little bit, to what I'll discuss, and that's the American Revolution. So Vincent Woodside was one of the most famous Freeport area masked agents. He was in charge of making sure the King's masks weren't used for something they shouldn't be, and made sure they ended up in the King's Navy. So here's a little bit about Vincent Woodside. He was a Tory, although his father, Captain William Woodside, commanded the blockhouse at McCoy Bay, which is just a little bit down the road from Brunswick, and the foundations of Woodside Sawmill. But what happened was when the Revolution broke out, a mob in Brunswick buried Woodside up to here, alive, under the Liberty Tree. He was unearthed, however, by 3 friends who hid him safely away until danger was past. And the colonel changed his political views overnight and lived on Flying Point for many years as an honored resident. So lastly here, with regard to the Dummer claim, you can see Woodside Sawmill, so quite an enterprise here. Wentworth Man Landing, there's remnants of the wharf that show the a store there. A second schoolhouse, the Cove Cemetery. The first schoolhouse, the Anderson's Blockhouse, which we are currently excavating that site. And if you want to learn more about that, as Connie said, please visit our website and go to our archaeology pages. A brickyard, and where there's at least 6 feet deep of remnants of brick that are over 300 years old. The salt works, and on a tidal mill, Pote's Grist Mill, and Little River Cemetery there. All on Dummer's claim. A little bit about Thomas Means, Major Thomas Means. His father, Thomas Means, was massacred by the Indians during a raid at Flying Point in 1756. And you can see a little bit more here about Means. Let you read that for a minute. And then a final view of Dummer claim from Flying Point all the way through, with the Ulster-Scot immigrants here all along the way. Now I'll segue into the War for Independence and Ulster-Scots patriot ancestors. The staging point, the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. What were the residents of ancient North Yarmouth up to? Well, we've been researching that. Within our culture, we find that the residents were leaning into community and economy. They had been established 50 years prior to the beginning of the War for Independence. So they were very rooted. Their contributions to the founding and integrity of the United States was the beginning of a 249-year experiment in self-rule. The Ulster-Scots in ancient North Yarmouth, the community response to the battles following Lexington and Concord in April 1775, and burning of Falmouth on October 18th, 1775. Well, they found it to be too close to home. Thomas Means II and 19 other settlers, second-generation Ulster-Scot descendants, enlisted that week. Thomas Means enlisted for 3 years, where it was required to enlist for at least a year. He enlisted for 3, for the long haul. And their focus was on self, family, and community in that order. So there was culturally a push for a flourishing community, already established for 50-some years. They listened to each other, hearing each other. They focused on those with the greatest need. They mobilized, they turned their energy into community causes, petitions, and resolves, which we are currently studying in the North Yarmouth Historical Society's archives. And their actions were to dialogue and partner in their community network. This was recently discovered in the North Yarmouth Historical Society's archives, and I'd like to read it. It's from the North Yarmouth Cumberland County Congress Resolves, dated September 14, 1775. So we think the colonies deserve a better treatment from His Majesty than this which assents to. We are his loyal subjects and merit his regard, and can't help thinking that if he would pursue his own unbiased judgment and lay aside the selfish counsel of wicked and designing men, he and his subjects would be mutually happy and provocations on both sides erase. But since the ministry have borne their tyranny to such a length as to endeavor to execute their wicked designs by military force in our metropolis, we fear it is their aim to introduce despotic monarchy. But though their tyranny and full oppression seems now with hasty strides to threaten all the colonies with ruin and destruction, we hope no vengeance will affright or wiles allure us to give up our dear-bought liberty, that choicest boon of heaven, which our fathers came into these regions to enjoy, and which we therefore retain while life enables us to struggle for its blessings. So the settlers were listening to the voices of their ancestors. They were claiming, improving, and owning land. They were practicing their clan ways. And they were leaderships. They were pillars of the community, the Andersons, Chases, and so on. So not influenced by the outside. So why engage? Well, there was a shared sentiment among the residents that we live in a wonderful place among wonderful people. Our numbers don't tell this whole story of who we are. And listening hard to each other revealed a common sense of disconnection with authority and strengthened their resolve. I want to say that the Scots-Irish migration starting in 1718, as I posited early on, formed the backbone of many Maine communities, and the cultural ways they brought with them have been over time woven into the very fabric of everyday American life. And those ways have been passed down to us in 1,000 ways through the centuries. Their influences can be found in our legal systems, local control preferences, relationships to the land, and dry Maine humor. Here's a maxim excerpted from the Declaration of Arbroath, dated April 6, 1320, that you are probably familiar with. It's inherent in the Scots-Irish disposition. Quote, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any condition be brought under English rule. It is in this truth not for glory, not for riches, not for honors that we're fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." So a sense of truly living is more than prolonging life. And it's all the things that mattered most to their people, their tribe, and their clan. And there was a shared responsibility among them and a common purpose. What did they work to preserve and protect? Self-rule, safety, and security. The stewardish self-rule, the stewards of the land, a sense of place and connection with the land. The land was in them and they were in the land. Justice, being treated fairly given historical injustices. A democratic sector of self-governance, and that we are bigger than being lockstep with others. This is not Massachusetts. Safety and security, for sustenance, access to good food, livestock, restful sleep, the comforts of home. Kinship, love and happiness in our homes. Healthcare, we want our caregivers, midwives, doctors, and nurses. If you've ever read Martha Ballard's journal on her midwifery, it's absolutely outstanding. And we've built a community where people are kind and generous. So looking out for the common welfare and control over our own future to preserve, nurture, expand. employ our community thriving and strengthen trust. So there was a diligence among our people to keep it going. And how did they respond to the threat of being uprooted again? Well, they mobilized. There was a call to action. So you can see at center here, them feeling alienated by royal governors, by commerce and trade, by the work that the very hard work that they did on a daily basis, and by merchants and speculators. They built alliances. So across this table here, got Governor Benning Wentworth, Silent Wentworth, Schofield family, and the native. So I'll tie these together. Governor Benning Wentworth was he was the first provincial royal governor of New Hampshire. He was my 6th generation great-granduncle. And his nephew was Silas Wentworth, my 5th generation great-grandfather. But Governor Wentworth had interests in the King's Highway and King's Woods, was very into land grabbing. He owned over 900 acres on the Topsham settlement in Maine, most of Harpswell Neck, and probably more than half of the province of New Hampshire. He was also instrumental in instigating the Pine Tree Riot of 1772. Now, his nephew, Silas Wentworth, was born in Dorchester, Stoughton, Mass. He made his way to Casco Bay in the 1750s on purpose. He started to get on the right side of the issue, if you will, and he was disinherited by the Wentworth family. So he made his way to Topsham and Harpswell. He was apprenticed by Governor Wentworth, made this possible, apprenticed to the Schofield family in Harpswell, and he owned land on the Topsham settlement. Now, the Schofield family were immigrants, and they were in the shipbuilding industry, seafaring, and medicine. And the narrative at the time that mobilized our people, one was Thomas Paine. So in his pamphlet, Common Sense, that he published in January 1776, that pamphlet was read to our Mainers, and that got them stirred up. That brought out the reaver in them. And there were the Sons of Liberty, and then Levi Preston, and if you're not familiar with him, I'll just read an excerpt here. But sometime around 1843, these are all the contemporaries here. A young man named Mellon Chamberlain interviewed Levi Preston, an aging veteran of the American Revolution. Then 91 years old, Preston had been in his early 20s in 1775, when British soldiers marched out of Boston to search for arms and rebels in nearby Concord, Massachusetts. Quote, "What made you go to the Concord fight?" Chamberlain wanted to know. Preston responded, "Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to." So what was the bottom line? I can only imagine my 5th generation great-grandfather, Silas Wentworth, who also served, coming to this conclusion that I would rather live and die here being surrounded by loving, generous, and happy people than to carry on with the old money, the posturing, the chaos, the titles, the politics, and the so-called prestige of a privileged life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, on the service of our American Revolutionary War patriots, men and women, said these heroes who dared to die and leave their children free. And lastly, the Oath of Enlistment of 1778, the Congress, or Continental Congress rather, had created 2 different oaths, one in 1775, this is one from 1778, February 3rd. And I'm wondering, Alan Anderson, are you there? Alan?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Can you see this slide okay?
Yes.
Would you mind, and then changing out the name, if you will, would you mind saying out loud, speaking out loud, this enlistment?
You want me to use Thomas's name?
I want you to use one of your patriots' names, if you know.
I, Alan Anderson, do acknowledge the United States of America to be free, independent, and sovereign state, and desire that the people thereof own, owe no allegiance or obligation to George III, King of Great Britain. And I renounce, refuse, and object any allegiance or obedience to him. And I do swear or affirm that I will, to the utmost of my power, support, maintain, defend the said United States against the said King, George III, and his heirs and successors, and their abettors, assistants, adherents, and will serve the said United States in the assigned tasks, rank in the Continental Army, which I hold with fidelity according to the best of my skills and understanding. So help me God.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to share a poem. I'll end with a poem here that was written by a family member, and it's entitled An Ulster-Scots Journey. At the bleeding edge of endeavor, the borderlands always our home, passed down from beyond forever, our marrow, our blood, and our bone. The passion to lead, not to follow, to strike out from frontiers unknown, not knowing what challenge tomorrow, but knowing we won't fight alone. We stand with our kinsmen together. We stand fast with those gone before. We fight for the land where they gather, and will sleep in their dust by the shore. Thank you. Now we're ready for some questions. I need to leave in 15 minutes. And Dave McCausland has offered to pick up for me, but any questions? Thank you, Connie.
Magnificent. Thank you, Dr. Julie. Comments, questions for Dr. Julie?
This is Alan. Can you hear me?
Again?
Yes.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was born in Portland, although I don't really have long family history in Maine. But my first year out of college, I was the head band or the band director at Brunswick High School, and actually lived right across the bridge in Topsham. So it was really interesting to see all that stuff of that area. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
You weren't in my band, were you? Or
No, Dave might have been though, or Debbie.
I think we need to raise funds, Dr. Julie, and see that this is presented on Netflix, Stars, and anywhere else. It was just an excellent presentation and very well timed.
Yes, this is Bill McLeod. I went to Wentworth Institute of Technology. Is there any relationship to the Wentworths up in Maine?
There are, very much so. Yes, I've been to that institute as well. I visited. It's in Dorchester Heights, yes?
No, yeah, close to that area, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, I grew up in Quincy, and I walked past John Adams and John Quincy Adams' homestead every day going to grammar school.
Oh, I'm jealous. Oh, that's wonderful. By osmosis, did you learn anything?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But the Ulster-Scots actually had to fight not only when they were in the border country, but I guess even when they were in Northern Ireland fighting the Irish. So there's a book that was called Bond Fighting. I think it was by the senator in Virginia. I forget his name, but I did go to a lecture that he gave talking about how the Scotch-Irish had to fight their whole history to be free.
Oh, yes.
Along the border country in Ireland, and also in Maine and New Hampshire.
Does George have a question out of Illinois?
No, I just got a new computer and I haven't figured out how to work it yet.
And now, speaking of, you might want to check out a presentation, a recorded video on our website that has to do with Dr. Chris Gerard out of the University of Durham on the Dunbar prisoners. We just sponsored him in a talk. When was that, Dave? Was that in May?
Yeah, it was in the 1st of June,
Oh.
talking about the Dunbar Scottish prisoners from 1650, I think. The Battle of Dunbar in Scotland, where those Scottish prisoners were forced to march 300 or 400 miles to Durham, England. Over 5,000 were killed during that battle. Another 5,000 were forced to march. A couple thousand died on the way to the cathedral. Most of those prisoners were forced to work in what are the Fens area of England, where they drained a massive area of England. But 150 of those prisoners were transported to the Sawgust area of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and were subject to 7 years of indenture before they were freed.
Yeah.
Lectures on our website.
And so, Gerard, you'll see in that lecture that he's eliciting support from all of us in that research as to trying to make the proof, the concept that there's a connection between those Dunbar prisoners and our Ulster-Scot heritage.
You know, Dr. Julie, John Mann spoke to the forum probably a year or so ago, but and you didn't go into it, but would you just tell the group a little bit about the Maine Ulster Project and what all you do up there? It's just an incredible set of accomplishments.
Well, we do a lot of research. We gather on an annual basis for many years now. We've gathered stories from Ulster-Scot immigrant descendants, and we have compiled those stories. And you can go to our website and read our family digest. And that's through a lot of proven history to verify or validate those family histories. Dave and another were instrumental in putting together ship lists and lists rather. And while there are no existing manifests for the passengers, the ship lists have been studied for many, many years now and presented on our website as well. Archaeologically, we're doing research on homestead sites of our first settlers. And we have publications. Check out our website. Dave can speak more to that in a moment. But we have events. For this year, for example, you can check out our Patriots pages that we have to celebrate our Ulster-Scots and their contribution to the Great War. And Dave, did you want to mention anything about our publications?
We do have 3 books available. One is called Reflections, 300 Years of Ulster-Scots in Maine. And that basically is a compendium of papers that were presented at a 300-year anniversary of the 1718 immigration to Maine. We held a big conference at Bowdoin College that was extremely well attended, and over the course of 3 days had, I think, 18 different academic presentations. And that book really is a fantastic. It's again the compendium of all the papers that were presented. Would strongly offer that book to you all. And then there's a couple of other books more about the Ulster-Scots on the coast of Maine. One of them particularly talks about the Flying Point area that Julie discussed in one of the families, the Means family there.
Well, and lastly, I'll just speak on, Connie, about our alliances that we have, our partnerships with the Ulster-Scots Agency out of Belfast, as well as the Ulster-Scots Community Network and many of coordinated programs, educational programs that we have established and delivered with them. And current research, we write essays. We're submitting an essay to the Maine Historical Society concerning the concept of liberty within our Ulster-Scots community. And other things like that, events and programs, and of course our annual presence at the Maine Highland Games in our heritage tent.
I have a question, if I may, and maybe it's related to getting some advice to you on looking at Presbyterian clergy who came from Ulster and then led a lot of the migrations into the New World. I have my family was came in from North Carolina, and they were brought in by one of the guys who started a lot of there was a colony called Williamsburg in South Carolina that was sort of initiated. It was a Presbyterian colony within the state that was initiated by Presbyterian clergy who then recruited people to buy the land. And there was a guy named John Baxter, who was a Presbyterian minister who started a number of the churches, and his son was a colonel in the Revolutionary Army. And my direct ancestor was sort of chain migration, was his nephew, but their father was a guy named David McGregor in Ulster, probably in County Down. And I'm trying to get more information about him. He had a cousin, it appears, because the family names are all the same, named James McGregor, who sailed in one of the ships to New England, and that group became the Greggs that were in Londonderry, New Hampshire. So there was sort of a connection between some of the ships that came into Boston, and then from there they went both to Maine and to New Hampshire, and they were all a lot of the families were related, and they all came. You know, at one point they seemed like they had been at Derry right around the time of the Williamite War and the siege on Derry, and not only in the city but in the countryside around it. And then some of them evidently moved from there to Antrim, to Belfast, and to County Down as well. And then they would take their congregations. You know, they would come to serve as the pastors for the communities, and then they would bring some of their people in there. But I've kind of hit a little bit of a wall in going from this country, where I know sort of what happened, back to figuring out what exactly the family connections were and the clergy connections were with the Presbyterians in Ulster, who seem to have gotten a lot of their training in Scotland, where they would go back to the lowlands of Scotland. They would get their sort of ministerial credentials, and then they would go from there to Ulster, and then ultimately from Ulster back to the U.S., where some of them went to Western New Jersey, where I am now, where there's some of the churches were, like mine was founded in 1698, some there, some in Maryland, and then some were in New England, and then a few of them came from Charleston, and then went through the founded the colony in South Carolina. So I was kind of curious as to what your advice would be to who to talk to in Ulster now, to kind of understand what the situation is. I have a few clues about some of these Presbyterian ministers who then went to the migrations to the U.S. You know, a lot of them were also in Newcastle, Delaware, and into Philadelphia, and then down through the Great Wagon Road. But I'm not sure exactly where to go from here to get the best information.
Dave, do you want to field this? Because I'm going to go ahead, and sorry to hit and run. I've got to head off. I'm a docent, and I've got a tour starting in about 45 minutes. So I'm going to turn it over to very aptly Dave.
Thank you.
Before you leave, Julie, I just want to once again, wonderful job.
Yeah,
Julie.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good presentation.
All right, Dave, go for it.
John, I can speak a little bit. My area of expertise really is in the 1718 time period, with the folks coming from Ulster into Maine. I know that, as you had stated, that there were several Presbyterian ministers and churches that came earlier. I know there's a Presbyterian minister, Mackey, that came into, I think, Delaware in the mid 1600s. And there may be some sporadic ones. Again, I'm more familiar with what happened into New England, where in the 1715, 1720 time period in Ulster, as Julie had mentioned, because of the rack renting and the famine and smallpox and the Test Act, which was a real big deal, in that the Presbyterian ministers in Northern Ireland, Ulster, could not baptize, they couldn't marry, and they couldn't bury people. I believe that Test Act started in 1704, but it certainly got to a real crux in the 1718 time period. That's why many of the folks started coming with their ministers to New England. At the same time, Cotton Mather in Massachusetts, a Puritan, was looking for defenses north of Boston against the Indian and the French. So the timing kind of worked out that you had a lot of churches in Northern Ireland wanting their people to come, and New England inviting them. Unfortunately, what happened when these ships started coming into Boston, they were seen as Irish and not really welcomed into Puritan Massachusetts. And I always kind of kid saying that Cotton Mather said, well, there's land up there in Maine, it's great land, go ahead and settle up there, forgetting to tell the people that the Indians, the local Native Americans, were not too thrilled with all these white folks coming in. But going back to your Presbyterian thing, I know in New England, there's a very famous petition, Schuette's petition, where 300 Ulster-Scots signed petition that they wanted to come to New England. They were led by 7 Presbyterian ministers in the 1718-20 time period. I believe 7 of those ministers that were on the petition did in fact come. I know of at least 3, if not 4 of those ministers only stayed in New England for a couple of years and went back. But their parishes, their congregations stayed in New England. I'm not sure I really answered your Presbyterian question down south. Unfortunately, I'm just not aware of the New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. And also, I think the last thing I'd say is a lot of it depends on the time period you're talking about.
Well, it's the same time period you're talking about, but what I'm having more trouble with is researching it from the Ulster point of view. So you mentioned you had some connections there.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you've looked into Prony,
No.
which is the equivalent of the National Archives, Prony, Proni. That absolutely should be your first step. Their website is fantastic. They are the repository of most of the written documents and records. Unfortunately, Ireland had a massive fire late 1800s that destroyed a tremendous amount of records. Unfortunately, the English, under the English government, they made all the parishes move their records to this national repository, and then it burned down. But Prony is fantastic. In my own case, you can type in your last name and I think maybe time period, and it will start to show you anytime that name is mentioned in a petition, a deed, a marriage contract. That should absolutely be your first place. Prony.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And John, I have a similar issue with some of my family members, and I'm going to type my email address into the chat. But I know I have names of a couple of genealogists in Northern Ireland who might be able to help you, and a couple other sources. So if you'll email me, I'll send you what I've turned up. I don't have it in front of me at the moment.
You had mentioned the battle of the siege of Derry. There are pretty good records of folks that were involved with that. What 1690-ish. But then unfortunately, there's kind of a gap. As with Ireland itself, you kind of have to know what parish or townland the family was from, and that makes things pretty difficult because if you just know they came from Ulster but don't know where, then it's not much help. But
I do have some of that from some letters, but I'm just trying to figure out where to go from here.
you might luck out, and it might be one of the parishes, the Presbyterian parishes that are still going, and they may have good record. I know the parish at Agadooey and Dunbo have real good records.
Well, that was actually where my family was from, was Akadui, was one of the places there.
All right, well, that's one of our ships. You had mentioned New Hampshire. My family
Yep.
came in on the Robert, which came into Casco Bay. 14 of those families the next spring went to New Hampshire. So
Right.
possibly our family, well, you're a Greg. I
Yes.
didn't realize your last name. Obviously, you have a huge history in New Hampshire. Our forefathers were on the same ship, John.
Yep. Well, that's why that's why I was asking, and there was a lot of questions about a nexus between three branches of the family. One came in into South Carolina through Charleston, and one came in through Newcastle and Philadelphia that were Quaker. So, and they were all connected.
Yeah, I'm curious, what time period was that into North
Same
Carolina?
time period you're talking about. You know,
Really?
16
All right, well,
yeah, same exact time period.
That's new. Of course, some of the ships that came into Boston originally were headed further south, and I guess there was some storm, and the supposed 5 ships, I don't know, were all destined into Boston, but ended up there.
Yep.
Dave, you said Agadooey, and what was the other very good resource? I didn't get it down.
Another church is Dunboe, Dunboe. They're within, I don't know, 20 miles of each other. Dunboe's on the northern coast. That particular church is kind of interesting. They did in 1718 as part of their remembrance. It was really cool. Their church, they had cutouts made of the 300 people that left just and put them in the church pews just to visually show what happened to a parish when all of a sudden 300 people leave all at once and how empty the church must have been. And that's one of the biggest things that we kind of learned out of that 1718 conference. We here in America want to know where our families came from. The folks over in Northern Ireland are now just starting to come to a point of saying, where did our family members go to and what happened to them? Of course, in their history, 300 years is no big deal. Whereas for us, obviously 300 years back is a big deal. But I think I have it on the website. But the pictures from that church showing these cutouts is a real wonderful visual of take 300 people out of a parish, what a hole it must have left for them.
Thank you.
Dave, I had another question.
Sure.
She mentioned, I think, that the expanse of the Dummer property or whatever grant was like up to Brunswick and then down to North Yarmouth. Is North Yarmouth, is that Portland or is it north of Portland or?
North Yarmouth is just north of Portland. To give a little bit of history, in 1718, you had all the Indian Wars and so forth, that in the 1710, 1712 time period, there were no white families north of Wells, Maine, which is 10, 15 miles into Maine. Mm-hmm. All of the rest of the white folks have been driven out. 1710, 1712, white folks start to move back into Maine a little bit. Portland, which is the largest city currently of Maine, at the time of 1718, had only 4 families in Portland. In 1718, all of a sudden, the ship that John's family was on and my family was on had about 50 families on board. All of a sudden, the fall of 1718, here's a ship of 50 families. And at the same time, one of the founders of Portland is trying to get an established town where they need 50 families before they can be considered a town. And all of a sudden here, 50 Scots-Irish families show up. To answer your question, Yarmouth is probably 15 miles north of Portland. The Freeport, Dummer claim, Flying Point Freeport is maybe 15 miles on the coast. And then you have Brunswick that's 25 miles north.
Thanks.
So my family had a house that I grew up in during the summers in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Is there any connection, or they just reused the same names between the one in Maine and Nova Scotia? Because there were also ferries that were going back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1960s, I think the ferry started from Portland to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. I don't think there's any connection at all. It's just a reuse of an English name, like Falmouth, Scarborough. I mean, you can name 50 towns that are English based, as well as that list that Julie showed. There are well over 50 towns, major towns in Maine, that were all founded by Ulster-Scots, all up and down. Belfast, Maine is a fairly good sized town on the coast. That was named after Belfast, Northern Ireland. In fact, it's kind of a fun story there. When that was founded in the 1750s by the Ulster-Scots, they were trying to decide the name, and they wanted to do Londonderry. And they said, well, no, there's a Londonderry, New Hampshire, and maybe Belfast. They ended up flipping a coin, and Belfast won.
Wow.
You know, as I've traveled throughout the United States, there are many, many, many towns and counties and cities named for Scotland cities and Scotland's people. It's so interesting.
There's no question, at least with the Ulster-Scots that came into New England, as Julie said, even to this day, I think we consider ourselves Scottish. Even though the way I describe it, my family came in and they were originally from the Loch Lomond area of Scotland. Had a chance to visit that territory a couple of weeks ago. We were in Scotland. In 1620-ish, they left Loch Lomond for Northern Ireland, hung out in Northern Ireland for 100 years, and then came to New England. But I can still consider ourselves Scottish.
Yeah, my family came from the Loch Lomond area originally too, and had the identical story. So it seemed like there were kind of two migrations. One from it included not just the border areas and some of the areas around Ayr, but it seemed like there were some from the Loch Lomond area as well that went to Northern Ireland about the same time, and then went from there again to the New World about the same time.
John, we definitely should connect. If you're from the Loch Lomond area, we've done a lot of research recently of that area. My last name is McCausland. It's a sept of Buchanan, but in doing the research, the McCauslands sold out in the late 1500s to the Calhouns.
Right.
They had a big fight with the McGregors.
My family.
we got to talk, John, because our families 500 years ago were probably 20 miles from each other.
Yeah.
Quick story: I'm doing the research of where to go when we went to Scotland a couple of weeks ago, and I had it all mapped out of where I know that they were. There's been some archaeology digs there, but what I didn't realize that it's in an area of the Loch Lomond area called Fast Lane, which happens to be the UK's nuclear sub base. And the land that was the McCausland land ultimately is now where they store all of their nuclear armaments, and you can't get with it. It's definitely well protected and fenced off. Even though I couldn't see that on Google Earth, I'm figuring, oh, I'm looking at 400-year-old maps and saying, this is where we're from. And gee, this road gets there and I can get to the actual valley. But I didn't see the fencing that protects the Defense Department's armaments. Most of NATO's armaments, even today, are on this mountain that was once, John, our common clan lands.
Wow.
Let's connect afterward.
I've been wondering where that was located for a long time. Thank you.
Yeah, it's on the western side of Loch Lomond. And again, I was really excited about going there, and then started to realize, well, wait a minute, it's a nuclear sub base. They're not going to let me walk around and see where my 400-year-old ancestors were.
Yes, we continue to educate. I think there's a need to continue to educate Americans about all the Ulsters. Many people think that the Scots-Irish were a mixture of Scots and Irish, and really they were descended from Scotland, lived in Northern Ireland for anywhere from 1 to several hundred years before they had the means to migrate to America or some other country. And I've had a kind of a comical similar situation here in Scotland now that I've lived here for a couple of years, trying to convince Scots that we diaspora Scots in America consider ourselves Scots. That's a foreign concept here, and they just can't grasp it. Many of them can't grasp it.
I think that's mainly because unless we're Native Americans, none of us are really Americans, right? Everybody is from somewhere. And so we kind of like to connect to it. And Scotland has the whole romance of being from Scotland. So why not? I'll finish up by saying, for the folks that are not acquainted with the early history of Ulster, essentially the plantation, the immigration from Scottish and English into Northern Ireland, that's another whole story unto itself. And the reasons for that, unfortunately, it starts to get into a little bit of politics and religion, which are still being fought 400 years later. But that is a story unto itself.
Dave, I'd very much like to invite you to be a speaker, so I would like to reach out to you, please. Any other thoughts or questions or comments for Dave McCausland?
Connie, a question for you. Did you get married in Scotland?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes, I got married in early May to Mr. Hope Veer Anderson. He has a joke. He said it's like a boy named Sue. But yes, I did, Randy.
Well, that's cool to be married in Scotland.
Thank you. Very small private service.
You had a piper there, though, didn't you?
Of course.
All right.
Yeah, Connie,
Okay.
I'll be talking in September, I believe it is. But anyway, about North Carolina, and of course the Ulster-Scots, which settled the western part of the state, very important in the development of the state. So I'm looking forward to talking about that and how they did interact with the Highland Scots is quite interesting. And of course, as far as place names, as you know, we do have Scotland County, North Carolina. So definitely have our Scottish heritage here.
And that was also where Flora MacDonald settled with her husband, Alan. And I've
Yeah,
been to
correct. She settled in Red Springs, North Carolina, which is near one of the places that our group has commemorated with a plaque, and be adding to our website the Mill Prong House, which was built by a Scot in 1795. So we'll be talking about that as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's kind of
no one
interesting because
mentioned
my
it's
family's from there too. It seemed like some of the Ulster-Scots tended to be more on the Patriot side, and some of the Highlanders in North Carolina were on the Loyalist side. And then ultimately, some of them stayed. But that's going to be probably very interesting to talk about, at least in the Revolutionary War time, the dynamics there.
Well, I'd like to think about it as the first American Civil War. You're absolutely right. You had the Highland Scots that had signed their loyalty oath when to come over to be given land, and they remember what happened after Culloden to those that went up against the crown. And you had the Ulster-Scots, of course, that had nothing to do with the English, didn't like them. They've been persecuted for years. They just wanted to be independent. And so you had these two groups together, and it was quite a dynamic.
Well, no
Awesome.
one will want to miss Bob McLeod's presentation, so stay tuned. We'll plan to see you that day, John. Okay, anything else before we adjourn? It's been stupendous. Dave, thank you so much. I'll be reaching out to you. And thanks to everyone. Please join every month if you're available. It's becoming more and more interesting as time goes on. So I wish you all safe and many blessings, safety and many blessings, and see you next month, please.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Dave.
Longeva.
Slàinte mhath.